This is not the original painting.
The crack echoed through the restoration hall like a gunshot. For one suspended heartbeat, nobody breathed. Then someone laughed. Well, Senior Curator Evelyn Moore said, brushing invisible dust from her silk sleeve. I suppose that's what happens when people drag rubbish into a world-class museum. A second laugh followed. Then another. The broken canvas lay on the examination table, its century-old linen split from corner to corner beneath the pressure of a utility blade that was never supposed to touch original paint. I stared at it without moving. My hands remained at my sides. No anger. No shouting. No desperate attempt to stop them. Only silence. Across the room, Assistant Conservator Daniel swallowed hard. Sir, he whispered. I didn't answer. Evelyn folded her arms. You've been insisting for 3 months that this filthy attic painting deserved laboratory testing. She glanced toward the trustees gathered behind the glass observation wall. Congratulations. Another curator smirked. You wasted everyone's time. Someone kicked a fragment of the shattered frame. It wasn't worth hanging in a cafe. Their voices blended together until they became meaningless noise. What they didn't know was that the painting had already stopped being important. Not because it lacked value, because everything that truly mattered had left this room 48 hours earlier. You aren't saying anything? Evelyn asked. I finally looked at her. No. She frowned. No. I have nothing to add. The calm in my own voice surprised even me. She had expected outrage. Accusations. A dramatic scene. Instead, I simply watched. Her confidence grew. I think, she announced loudly enough for the trustees to hear. This concludes Mr. Rowan Hale's little fantasy. Several nodded. One trustee sighed. I trusted your judgment, Rowan. The disappointment in his voice hurt more than Evelyn's mockery. For 12 years I had restored paintings no one else believed could survive. Fire damage, flood damage, knife wounds, acid, mold. Every impossible case eventually landed on my workbench. I never asked for recognition. Only enough time to let the paintings speak. Yet today, no one wanted evidence. They wanted certainty. And certainty belonged to whoever spoke first. Evelyn always spoke first. She walked around the table and picked up a dusty corner that had detached from the canvas. Look at this. She held it between 2 fingers as though touching garbage. The pigment is unstable. She rubbed the surface. Tiny blue particles drifted onto the floor. Daniel took an involuntary step forward. Please don't. Relax. She smiled. It's worthless. I watched another century of history disappear beneath her fingertips. Still, I didn't move. Because if I reached for that painting now, I would destroy something far larger than a canvas. The museum. 3 weeks earlier, rain hammered against the skylights as I climbed into the abandoned farmhouse outside Ashcombe. The owner wanted an insurance appraisal before demolition. Nothing more. Most of the house had already collapsed. Broken furniture lay beneath rotting beams. Birds nested where families once slept. Then I saw it. A canvas leaning face first against a fireplace. Covered in soot, mold, dust, water stains. At first glance, nothing remarkable. But restorers learn to notice things other people ignore. The weave, the nail pattern, the unusual ground layer visible beneath a torn edge. I crouched, carefully lifted the painting. My pulse slowed, then accelerated. There, hidden beneath centuries of grime, was a fragment of ultramarine so pure that no provincial workshop could ever have afforded it. I whispered to myself, no. I carried it home. No publicity, no announcement, just examination. Infrared imaging revealed alterations beneath the surface. Pigment samples matched materials unavailable to ordinary artists. Then came the signature. Not visible, not painted, pressed into the original, sizing beneath later varnish. Whoever concealed it had understood conservation methods centuries before modern science. I contacted no newspapers. Only one person, Professor Adrian Mercer, the leading authority on 17th-century masterworks. He arrived without assistance, without cameras. He studied the painting for almost 4 hours. When he finally stood, his hands were shaking. If this is genuine, he couldn't finish the sentence. Neither could I, because we both knew the name hidden beneath the dirt. A masterpiece lost for almost 180 years. A painting museums across Europe had searched for across generations. Worth far more than money. History itself. Adrian looked directly at me. Do not tell anyone. I wasn't planning to. They'll tear each other apart before allowing a junior conservator to discover this. He wasn't wrong. Back in the present. They're waiting. Daniel's whisper reached me. I looked toward the observation gallery. Trustees, department heads, media representatives invited for another exhibition announcement. Everyone watching, waiting for me to defend myself. Instead, I removed my white gloves, folded them, placed them neatly on the workbench beside the ruined masterpiece. Evelyn blinked. What are you doing? I picked up my employee identification card, my security badge, the small brass office key I'd carried for over a decade. I think, I said quietly, my work here is finished. Silence spread through the room. Someone laughed nervously. You can't be serious. I am. You'll resign over this? I met Evelyn's eyes. No, I'll resign because of everything that came before it. For the first time since entering the hall, her smile weakened. The resignation letter had been sitting in my satchel for 6 days. And signed, not because I doubted my decision, because I had hoped, foolishly, that the museum would remember why it existed. To preserve history, not reputations. Evelyn crossed the room before I could reach the door. You don't get to create a scene and leave. I'm creating no scene. You brought an unverified object into this institution. It was verified. Her eyebrows rose. By whom? I looked at the torn canvas behind her. It doesn't matter anymore. She laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. You finally accepted you were wrong. No. Then explain yourself. I don't owe an explanation to people who destroyed evidence before examining it. A murmur rippled through the trustees behind the glass. Evelyn's expression hardened. Evidence. The painting deserved patience. It deserved disposal. Daniel spoke before he could stop himself. Ma'am, Mr. Hale requested isotope testing twice. Her head snapped toward him. And you're interrupting senior staff? He submitted the paperwork. I rejected it. I know. You have a problem with that? Daniel lowered his eyes. No. The room fell quiet again. I slipped the folded resignation letter onto the examination table. Chairman Lewis Harper entered through the side door at that exact moment. Gray-haired, measured, a man who rarely attended conservation disputes. His gaze moved from the ruined painting to my letter. What happened? Before anyone else spoke, Evelyn answered. Rowan overreacted after one of his speculative acquisitions failed authentication. Lewis frowned. Failed? Completely. And the painting? Destroyed during handling. She said it so casually that even Daniel looked stunned. Destroyed during handling. As though centuries of history were nothing more than broken office equipment. Lewis turned to me. Is that accurate? I could have argued. Produced photographs. Explained every ignored report. Instead, I simply nodded once. It has been destroyed. And your resignation? I've decided to accept another path. His eyes narrowed. You already had one. Perhaps. Evelyn smiled again, relieved. There you have it. But Lewis kept looking at me. Not at her. At me. As if waiting for words that never came. Finally, he sighed. I won't accept your resignation today. You don't have to. I said I won't. I understand. I'll expect you tomorrow morning. No. The single word settled over the room like fresh snow. Calm. Soft. Impossible to ignore. I won't be returning. I placed my badge beside the letter. Its metal edge clicked against the table. Such a tiny sound, yet somehow louder than every accusation spoken that afternoon. Without another word, I walked toward the exit. No one stopped me. Not because they respected my choice. Because they believed I had already lost everything worth keeping. Outside, evening rain coated the museum steps in silver. I stood beneath the stone archway and inhaled the cold air. For the first time in years, I felt strangely light. My phone vibrated. One message. Adrian Mercer. Has anyone touched the original? I looked back through the glass doors. Museum staff surrounded the ruined canvas. Photographers had begun documenting the damage. Trustees argued. Security officers hurried through the corridor. I typed a single reply. Yes. 3 dots appeared almost instantly. Then another message. Good. I stared at the screen. Another arrived. The laboratory authenticated every sample yesterday. The government has already registered the discovery. The digital scans, pigment analysis, fiber records, ownership chain, and sealed testimony are complete. My heartbeat remained steady. Then it's over, I replied. No, Adrian answered. It's just beginning. A black sedan rolled to the curb across the street. Professor Mercer stepped out himself. He rarely drove. Tonight he had. He didn't wave. He simply walked over, opened the passenger door, and looked back at the museum. They still don't know, do they? No. And you're leaving? Yes. He smiled faintly. Good. I looked once more at the building that had defined 12 years of my life. Inside those walls were friendships, sleepless nights, impossible restorations, quiet victories that no visitor would ever know. I felt grief, but not regret, because some places stop being homes long before people realize they have become prisons. Behind the museum's towering windows, Evelyn suddenly appeared in the entrance hall, gesturing angrily as staff rushed in every direction. Even from across the street, I could see the confidence draining from her face. Something had interrupted her victory. Someone had made a phone call. The consequences had begun to move. I turned away before discovering what they were. For the first time, I chose not to stay and save them. The door of the sedan closed behind me. The museum disappeared in the rain. The government archive occupied a quiet sandstone building overlooking the river. There were no marble statues, no grand banners, no donors' names carved into polished walls. Only rows of climate-controlled vaults and people who treated history with almost reverent silence. Professor Adrian Mercer walked several steps ahead of me. This way, a young archivist opened a secure door after checking 3 separate authorizations. Inside, a long table held dozens of sealed cases. One of them contained the object everyone believed had been destroyed that afternoon. Adrian rested his hand on the case. They ruined the decoy. I looked through the glass. The real painting lay perfectly still beneath conservation lighting. Months of careful cleaning had revealed colors so vibrant they seemed untouched by time. It still felt unreal. 48 hours before presenting the discovery to the museum, Adrian had insisted we prepare for the worst. I've worked with institutions for 40 years, he had told me. When prestige is threatened, evidence becomes inconvenient. So we documented everything. High-resolution scans, chemical analysis, thread mapping, historical ownership, even microscopic damage unique to the original canvas. The museum had never possessed the genuine masterpiece. Only a near-perfect conservation facsimile created for transport. The original had remained here under government protection. The deception had not been about distrust. It had been about preservation. Adrian glanced at me. You aren't relieved. I thought I would be. You've lost something. I lost 12 years. He nodded slowly. No. You lost the illusion that loyalty guarantees respect. His words lingered in the silent room. One of the archivists approached carrying a thick folder. Mr. Hale. I accepted it. Across the cover were printed only 3 words. Official recognition file. Inside were copies of every report bearing my name. Not the museum's. Mine. For years I had published research under department credit instead of personal authorship. It had seemed noble at the time. The institution mattered more than individuals. Now I realized something uncomfortable. Invisible work often became invisible people. Adrian sat opposite me. They'll call. I know. They'll apologize. I know. They'll promise reforms. I know. He smiled. And I closed the folder. I've already walked away. Across the city, the museum no longer sounded like victory. It sounded like panic. Chairman Lewis Harper slammed another report onto the conference table. Again, the legal advisor swallowed. The authentication request existed. I heard you. It was rejected internally. Lewis looked toward Evelyn. You rejected it? It was incomplete. Daniel stood against the wall, hands clasped tightly behind his back. His voice barely rose above a whisper. No, sir. Every eye turned toward him. The paperwork was complete. Evelyn's expression darkened. You've already embarrassed yourself enough. Daniel continued anyway. I processed the submission personally. Lewis leaned forward. What happened afterwards? Daniel hesitated. His fingers trembled. Evelyn interrupted. He misunderstood procedures. No. Daniel looked directly at the chairman. You instructed me to archive the request without forwarding it. The room froze. Lewis slowly turned back toward Evelyn. Is that true? She folded her arms. I exercised professional judgment. Did you suppress authentication? I prevented unnecessary expense. The estimated testing cost was less than £2,000. No answer. Lewis opened another folder. Why was Mr. Hale's access to laboratory scheduling revoked 6 weeks ago? Silence. Another page. Why were 3 independent experts removed from the review panel? Silence again. The legal advisor quietly shifted his chair away from Evelyn. Lewis's voice became frighteningly calm. Tell me everything. My phone rang. Unknown number. I let it ring. Again. 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 By evening, there were 11 missed calls. 3 emails. 5 messages. Every one came from someone inside the museum. Not one from Daniel. Not one from Lewis. Only department heads who had ignored me yesterday. Adrian watched me place the phone face down. You aren't curious? I already know what they'll say. And what is that? We didn't know. He nodded. The oldest sentence in every scandal. I almost smiled. But they chose not to know. The next morning began with headlines. Mysterious resignation rocks National Museum. Senior conservator leaves after disputed artwork incident. No one yet knew the truth. Only fragments. Enough to create rumors. Not enough to assign blame. That changed shortly before noon. A government spokesperson announced an emergency press conference regarding a historic cultural discovery. No names. No details. Only a location. The National Archive. My phone rang again. This time, Chairman Lewis Harper. I answered after the 6th ring. Mr. Hale. Chairman. His breathing sounded unusually heavy. I owe you an apology. I remained silent. I should have listened. Silence again. I've suspended 3 staff members pending investigation. Still nothing. I'd like to meet. For what purpose? So we can fix this. I looked through the archive window at the river below. Can the painting be restored? No. Can 12 years be restored? Another silence. Finally, he spoke quietly. I understand. No. I closed my eyes. You've only begun to. By afternoon, every major news network had gathered outside the National Archive. Satellite vans lined the street. Reporters rehearsed introductions, while photographers adjusted their lenses toward the main entrance. Inside, however, the atmosphere remained almost serene. No one chased headlines. The archivists continued cataloging manuscripts. A conservator quietly examined an ancient map beneath a microscope. History had survived kings, wars, and fires. It could survive another media storm. Adrian handed me a cup of tea. You don't have to stand beside me. I know. You could avoid all of this. I've avoided enough. He studied my face. You've changed since yesterday. I stopped waiting for permission. Before he could answer, the communications director entered. They're ready. We walked into the briefing hall. Nearly 100 journalists filled the room. Camera lights illuminated the podium. Behind it stood a covered easel. The painting remained hidden beneath dark conservation cloth. The culture minister stepped forward first. Thank you for attending on such short notice. Questions erupted immediately. Is this about the museum? Has a national treasure been found? Were reports of a destroyed masterpiece true? The minister raised a hand. Please. Gradually the room settled. He continued. 48 hours ago, the National Archive completed independent authentication of a painting believed lost since the 19th century. Murmurs spread across the hall. The examination included pigment analysis, fiber dating, infrared imaging, provenance research, and international peer review. A large screen behind him illuminated. Images appeared one after another. Laboratory reports, microscopic photographs, historical records, digital scans. Every page carried dates. Every date preceded the incident at the museum. The journalists immediately noticed. Hands shot into the air. When were these completed? Yesterday morning. So before the reported destruction? Correct. Another wave of whispers rolled through the room. The minister nodded toward Adrian. Professor Mercer approached the podium. I supervised the authentication. A reporter stood. Professor, was the painting destroyed? Adrian's answer came without hesitation. No. The room exploded. Flashes erupted from every direction. The object damaged at the museum was a documented conservation facsimile prepared during secure transfer. Someone shouted over the noise. Why use a replica? Adrian looked directly into the cameras. Because irreplaceable cultural heritage deserves protection. He paused. And because caution is wiser than trust. Across the front row, several reporters immediately began typing frantic updates. Phones vibrated throughout the room. Breaking news alerts spread within seconds. Then Adrian turned toward me. It is also time the public knew who discovered the painting. Hundreds of lenses shifted. For years I had stood behind exhibitions. Never before them. He spoke my name clearly. Senior Conservator Rowan Hale. No applause. Only stunned silence. The minister continued. Mr. Hale's documentation formed the foundation of the entire authentication process. Another screen appeared. This one displayed every report I had submitted to the museum. Each bore timestamps, submission dates, digital receipts. One final page appeared. Authentication request declined. The hall became completely still. No dramatic music. No accusations. Only facts. Facts had a weight that outrage never possessed. A journalist raised her voice. Who rejected these requests? The minister answered carefully. That matter is currently under formal investigation. He said no names. He didn't need to. Within minutes, every newsroom in the country would discover them independently. My phone buzzed continuously in my pocket. Dozens of messages, interviews, publishers, universities, former colleagues who had never defended me yesterday. I ignored everyone. After the conference ended, I stepped into a quiet courtyard behind the archive. The noise of the media faded behind stone walls. Daniel stood there. He looked exhausted. His museum badge hung loosely from one hand. You came. He nodded. I resigned this morning. I studied him for a long moment. You didn't have to. I know. He lowered his eyes. But I couldn't keep telling myself I was powerless. He handed me a small envelope. I found these before I left. Inside were photocopies of internal emails. Dozens of them. Several carried Evelyn's approval. Others included department managers. One message stood out immediately. Delay Hale's authentication until after the donor exhibition. We cannot risk another embarrassment if he's mistaken. Another read. Remove external reviewers. Keep this internal. I slowly folded the papers closed. Daniel looked at me nervously. Will you use them? I gazed toward the river beyond the courtyard. No. His expression changed. No. The investigation will. For the first time since I'd met him, Daniel smiled. Not because justice had arrived. Because he finally understood. I wasn't walking away from responsibility. I was walking away from control. The people who had built the lie would now have to live inside it. And this time, no one would be there to quietly save them. The investigation began without spectacle. No police sirens. No dramatic arrests. No television crews waiting outside the museum every morning. Instead, quiet men and women carrying slim leather folders arrived before opening hours and disappeared behind secured doors. History had always preferred patience. So did accountability. I learned about the first suspension from a newspaper I almost didn't buy. 3 executives placed on administrative leave. Evelyn's photograph occupied half the front page. Her confident smile had been replaced by an expression captured as she hurried past reporters with her face turned away. I folded the paper and continued drinking my coffee. Professor Mercer glanced over the rim of his own cup. You aren't reading it. I already know how it begins. And how does it end? They'll insist it was procedure. He smiled faintly. And after that, they'll blame each other. 3 floors beneath the museum's main galleries, the investigation team occupied the records department. Every email, every restoration request, every financial approval, every laboratory booking from the previous 5 years was being examined. Chairman Lewis Harper stood beside the lead investigator. I want complete transparency. The investigator didn't even look up. That depends on your staff. Lewis turned toward the conference room where department heads waited. For years they had entered meetings laughing. Today no one spoke. The silence felt heavier than accusation. The lead investigator placed another printed email onto the table. Who authorized laboratory restrictions against Mr. Rowan Hale? No answer. He asked again. Who signed this? A deputy director slowly raised his hand. I approved the recommendation. Based on what evidence? It came from Senior Curator Moore. And did you verify it? The man hesitated. No. Why not? We trusted her judgment. The investigator quietly made another note. One sentence. One signature. Another loose thread. At the National Archive, life settled into an unfamiliar rhythm. No committee meetings. No politics disguised as professionalism. Only conservation. Real conservation. My temporary workspace overlooked a restoration studio where 6 specialists worked without speaking unless necessary. Nobody competed. Nobody sought applause. The paintings received every conversation. Humans received only enough. It felt peaceful. An elderly conservator named Helena approached my bench carrying a cracked Renaissance panel. I hear you're impossible. I looked up. Excuse me. She smiled. They say you restore paintings people have already buried. I restore what still wants to survive. She nodded approvingly. Good answer. She placed the panel before me. Would you look at this? The damage was severe. Woodworm. Smoke. Previous amateur repairs. Most museums would have written it off decades earlier. I ran my fingertips just above the surface without touching it. Someone loved this once. Helena watched carefully. How can you tell? They repaired it 3 different times. She smiled. Exactly. For the first time in weeks. I forgot the museum. That afternoon my phone vibrated. Chairman Lewis Harper. Again. This time I answered immediately. Mr. Hale. Chairman. I've been authorized to make an offer. I'm listening. We'd like you to return. I almost laughed. You haven't finished investigating. We've already seen enough. I haven't. Silence. Then. The board wishes to appoint you Director of Conservation. A month earlier, I would have struggled to breathe after hearing those words. Now, I simply looked at the Renaissance panel waiting beside me. I decline. His voice tightened. You haven't heard the conditions. I don't need to. You've earned this. No. I spoke gently. I earned it years ago. He didn't interrupt. You simply noticed too late. The line remained quiet for several seconds. Finally he asked, what would convince you? I looked through the studio window where sunlight illuminated floating dust particles. Nothing. You mean that? I do. You'd abandon the museum? I already left. No. His voice carried genuine regret. We abandoned you. By evening, the investigators discovered something no one expected. It wasn't financial fraud. It wasn't theft. It was something smaller. And somehow worse. A storage ledger. 23 restoration projects credited to Evelyn Moore. 23. The handwriting on the treatment reports looked familiar. Painfully familiar. Because I had written them. Every observation. Every pigment note. Every repair sequence. Only one detail had changed before publication. The author's name. The lead investigator quietly requested every original draft. Within an hour, Daniel provided them. The originals all carried my signature. Someone had replaced the cover pages before archival filing. Years of invisible theft. Not of money. Of work. Of identity. The investigator closed the folder. What else has she taken? No one answered. Because suddenly, no one knew. I wasn't present when Evelyn Moore was confronted. Later, Daniel described the meeting so precisely that I could almost hear every word. She entered the conference room wearing the same immaculate navy suit she always chose for difficult board meetings. Perfect posture. Perfect hair. Perfect confidence. Until she saw the evidence. The lead investigator arranged 2 stacks of documents side by side. Original reports. Official reports. Only the names differed. He pointed to the first page. Would you explain this? She barely glanced at it. A filing error. He slid another across the table. And this? Administrative oversight. Another. And this? She folded her arms. You don't understand how departments operate. The investigator remained expressionless. I understand signatures. Lewis Harper leaned forward. So do I. He lifted a restoration catalog from 3 years earlier. Did you restore Madonna at dusk? Yes. Daniel, standing near the door, closed his eyes. Lewis placed another document beside the catalog. It was my handwritten treatment journal. Every stain, every chemical ratio, every sketch, signed and dated. Weeks before publication. He asked only one question. Who is Rowan Hale? For the first time in years. Evelyn couldn't answer immediately. The following morning, an investigative journalist named Clara Whitmore requested an interview. I almost refused. Then Adrian quietly said, she's different. How? She verifies before writing. That alone made her unusual. We met in a small cafe overlooking the river. She never switched on her recorder immediately. Instead, she asked, how are you sleeping? The question caught me off guard. I hadn't expected that. Everyone asks about scandals. She stirred her tea thoughtfully. I'm interested in what surviving one feels like. I considered the answer. Better than before. She smiled. I thought you might say worse. I've realized something. What? I mistook endurance for loyalty. She didn't interrupt. So I kept accepting things that should never have become normal. Clara finally activated the recorder. What happened the day you left? I told her about the torn canvas. The laughter. The silence. I did not exaggerate. I did not insult anyone. I simply described what I had seen. When I finished, she asked one final question. If you had one chance to stop them from destroying the replica? I looked out the cafe window. Rain had begun falling again. No. She frowned slightly. No. They had already ignored every warning before they touched the knife. I paused. If I had stopped them, they would have learned nothing. That evening, Clara's article appeared online. Its headline surprised everyone. Not because it attacked the museum. Because it didn't. The man who refused to save his own career. The story focused less on scandal and more on silence. How repeated dismissals had trained a gifted conservator to stop arguing. How institutions slowly erased people without noticing. Public sympathy shifted almost overnight. Not toward outrage, toward reflection. Former employees began sending anonymous statements. Retired curators shared forgotten incidents. External experts admitted their reviews had been canceled without explanation. Each story was small. Together, they formed a pattern impossible to dismiss. Late that night, Adrian placed a thick folder on my desk. They found another painting. I looked up. What kind? One everyone believed was beyond saving. He smiled gently. I told them there's only one person I trust with it. For the first time since leaving the museum, the future felt larger than the past. Outside, across the city, lights still burned inside the museum's executive offices. Investigators hadn't gone home. Neither had the board. Piece by piece, the institution was being forced to confront a truth far more painful than one destroyed masterpiece. It had spent years discarding the very people who kept its history alive, and no one could restore that damage with varnish, glue, or careful hands. The consequences had only just begun. The boardroom that had once intimidated every department head now felt strangely ordinary. No one argued over seating. No one hurried to claim the chair closest to the projector. The polished oak table remained the same, but authority had shifted. Not to a person, to evidence. Every chair except one was occupied. Evelyn Moore had been instructed to remain outside until called. Chairman Lewis Harper looked noticeably older than he had only 2 weeks earlier. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. The investigation had not merely uncovered procedural failures. It had exposed years of carefully cultivated deception. The lead investigator placed another archive box on the table. This is the final batch. Lewis nodded. Proceed. The investigator opened the lid. Inside were handwritten restoration journals dating back nearly 9 years. Every volume belonged to me. Every volume had somehow disappeared from museum storage after being submitted. Daniel quietly spoke. I thought they were misplaced. They weren't, the investigator replied. They were replaced. He held up 2 nearly identical folders. One contained my original treatment notes. The other was the museum's official archive. The technical language is identical. He turned another page. So are the diagrams. Another. So are the chemical calculations. Another. The only alteration is the author's identity. The room remained silent. No one looked surprised anymore. Only ashamed. Lewis rubbed his forehead. How many? The investigator answered without emotion. 38 restoration projects. Someone at the far end of the table whispered. My God. Another trustee looked physically ill. For years. He couldn't finish. Because everyone understood what those numbers represented. 38 opportunities. 38 stolen acknowledgments. 38 moments when the museum had applauded the wrong person. Lewis finally broke the silence. Bring her in. The door opened. Evelyn entered wearing another impeccably tailored suit. But today the confidence looked rehearsed. Her eyes moved around the room, searching for allies. She found none. The investigator gestured toward the folders. Please explain. She remained standing. I've already addressed these accusations. No. He slid the originals toward her. You addressed assumptions. He placed the official copies beside them. Now address facts. She picked up one report. Her expression barely changed. Department work belongs to the department. Lewis looked directly at her. Not according to employment law. She ignored him. Senior staff routinely review junior contributions. The investigator calmly nodded. They do. He turned another page. They don't erase authorship. She said nothing. He continued. They don't replace signatures. Another silence. They don't submit award nominations under their own names. That sentence landed harder than anything before it. Lewis blinked. Award nominations? The investigator opened a separate folder. International Conservation Excellence Award. Nominee. Evelyn Moore. Supporting documentation. My restoration journals. My photographs. My laboratory records. My words. Lewis slowly leaned back in his chair. I personally congratulated you. She looked at him without blinking. I accepted recognition for departmental success. No. His voice became almost unbearably quiet. You accepted another man's life. At the National Archive, none of us watched the hearing. Helena carefully cleaned the edge of a 16th-century icon while humming softly to herself. Adrian studied microscope images. I repaired a fractured wooden support one fiber at a time. History demanded concentration, not gossip. Around midday, my phone buzzed. Clara Whitmore. I answered. They've suspended her permanently. I expected that. You didn't ask how I know. I assumed you verified it. She laughed softly. I did. Then her tone became serious. There's more. I'm listening. The board has unanimously voted to issue a public correction for every restoration you've completed. I stopped working. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Everyone. They're republishing 9 years of records. I closed my eyes. Recognition. The thing I had quietly convinced myself no longer mattered. Yet hearing those words hurt more than I expected. Not because I wanted applause. Because someone had finally admitted the truth. Helena looked over from across the studio. Good news. I nodded once. Very. She smiled and returned to her work. As though truth arriving late was still worth celebrating. Perhaps it was. The museum's public auditorium reached capacity almost an hour before the scheduled announcement. Journalists filled every seat. Former employees lined the back wall. Conservation students stood shoulder to shoulder in the aisles. No exhibition had attracted this much attention in years. This time, people hadn't come to admire paintings. They had come to witness accountability. Chairman Lewis Harper approached the podium alone. No dramatic music. No promotional banners. Only the museum's emblem projected behind him. He looked into the cameras for several long seconds before speaking. Today is the most difficult day in this institution's modern history. No one interrupted. He continued. Our investigation has concluded. A large screen illuminated behind him. The first slide contained only one sentence. Integrity is the first duty of preservation. Lewis inhaled slowly. We failed that duty. He didn't soften the language. He didn't blame procedures. He didn't mention misunderstandings. He simply accepted responsibility. The investigation confirms that evidence submitted by senior conservator Rowan Hale was repeatedly ignored, delayed, and improperly restricted. Another slide appeared. Then another. Dozens of restoration projects. Each now displayed the corrected authorship. Lead conservator, Rowan Hale. The audience remained silent. Several journalists stopped typing. They simply stared. Lewis continued. Mr. Hale's professional contributions were systematically attributed to others. He paused. For that, his voice faltered. There is no acceptable excuse. The apology lasted less than 10 minutes. It felt longer than years. At its conclusion, one reporter stood. Will Mr. Hale return? Lewis answered immediately. No. Another question. Have you offered him leadership? Yes. Did he refuse? Yes. A third reporter raised her hand. Why? Lewis looked toward the corrected names still displayed behind him. Because some things cannot be repaired after they are broken. That evening, the museum quietly updated its entire digital archive. Every online catalog. Every conservation record. Every exhibition booklet. The changes appeared without fanfare. Anyone searching my name suddenly discovered dozens of works that had never officially belonged to me before. Universities began citing my papers correctly. Professional organizations issued revised acknowledgments. Invitations arrived from institutions across Europe. I accepted none immediately. Instead, I spent the evening repairing the delicate icon with Helena. When we finished, she stepped back and smiled. There, the fractures had disappeared. Not erased. Integrated. Visible only if someone knew exactly where to look. I admired the work. It still carries its history. Everything worthwhile does. She carefully placed the restored icon into its protective frame. You know, she looked at me thoughtfully. Wood teaches an interesting lesson. What lesson? When it breaks. She gently touched the repaired joint. Forcing it back into the old shape weakens it. I waited. You strengthen it by respecting where it cracked. Outside the studio window, sunset painted the river in shades of amber and gold. For the first time since leaving the museum, I understood something I had been unable to admit. Walking away hadn't been surrender. It had been restoration. Not of a painting, of myself. And somewhere across the city, the institution that had once defined my life was finally learning the same lesson. Too late for the past, but perhaps not too late for its future. Winter arrived quietly. The river outside the National Archive carried thin ribbons of mist every morning, and frost settled across the old stone courtyard before the first archivists unlocked the doors. For the first time in years, I no longer dreaded Mondays. No committee meetings waited behind polished doors. No political calculations hid behind polite smiles. Only work. Real work. The Renaissance panel Helena had entrusted to me now rested beneath soft conservation lamps. Weeks of patient treatment had transformed it. The smoke-darkened saints had begun emerging from beneath centuries of neglect, their expressions growing clearer with every careful layer removed. Helena joined me just after sunrise. "You've barely touched the overpaint. It isn't ready." She nodded approvingly. "You've learned the hardest lesson." I smiled. I thought I already knew it. "No." She folded her arms. "You knew how to restore paintings." She looked at the panel. "Now you're learning when not to hurry." Before I could answer, Adrian entered carrying a thick envelope. "It arrived this morning." He placed it beside my microscope. The return address belonged to the International Institute for Cultural Preservation. I recognized the crest immediately. They're quick. They've been waiting. I opened the letter carefully. Inside was an invitation. Not an award. Not a ceremony. An appointment. Chief Restoration Consultant. European Heritage Recovery Program. 3 years. Dozens of endangered collections. Historic sites across multiple countries. Complete academic independence. I read the final paragraph twice. "Your work demonstrates not only exceptional technical ability, but uncommon professional integrity." Integrity. A word that meant more now than any title ever could. Adrian watched me silently. "Well, I don't know." He laughed. "That's because you're thinking about responsibility instead of prestige. I've spent 12 years believing responsibility meant staying. And now," I looked around the quiet studio. "Maybe it means knowing when to leave." 3 days later, the National Archive hosted a modest gathering. No reporters. No television cameras. Only conservators, historians, and archivists from across the country. The purpose wasn't to celebrate me. It was to discuss new national conservation standards. The museum scandal had forced every institution to examine itself. Lewis Harper attended. When I saw him entering the conference hall, he hesitated before approaching. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I almost didn't. I wouldn't have blamed you." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then he quietly handed me a leather-bound notebook. "I found this." I recognized it immediately. My first restoration journal. The one I thought had disappeared forever. I ran my hand across the worn cover. The corners were frayed. A faint stain marked the back where coffee had spilled nearly 10 years earlier. "You kept it?" He shook his head. "No. It was hidden." His expression tightened. "We discovered an entire cabinet of original journals behind false archive shelving." I opened the notebook. My handwriting greeted me exactly as I remembered it. Rough sketches. Chemical formulas. Tiny observations no exhibition visitor would ever notice. The person who wrote these pages believed hard work always spoke for itself. I felt unexpectedly protective of that younger version of myself. Lewis broke the silence. "I'm sorry." This time the apology sounded different. No institution stood behind it. No microphones. No legal advisors. Only one man. "I should have asked questions years ago. You trusted the wrong people. I stopped paying attention." "That's different." He lowered his eyes. "I don't expect forgiveness." I considered my answer carefully. "Good." He looked surprised. "Because forgiveness isn't something you request." I closed the journal. "It's something you earn." He nodded slowly. "I understand. I think you do now." When the conference began, Lewis returned to the audience instead of the stage. He never tried to share credit. For the first time since I'd known him, he seemed willing to listen. The reforms spread farther than anyone expected. Within 2 months, museums across the country introduced new authorship policies. Every conservation report now required individual attribution. Independent review panels became mandatory for major discoveries. Anonymous ethics reporting systems were established. Younger conservators began sending letters to the National Archive. Some simply said thank you. Others shared stories they had never dared tell before. One evening, Helena found me reading them. "You've started something." I didn't intend to. The best changes rarely begin with intention. She sat beside me. A letter lay open between us. A conservator from a small coastal museum had written, "After hearing your story, I finally corrected a report my supervisor asked me to falsify. I thought I would lose everything. Instead, I discovered I still had myself." I folded the letter carefully. I wish none of this had happened. Helena smiled gently. So do I. But it did. She looked around the restoration studio. The question is whether suffering becomes a wall. She touched the stack of letters. Or a doorway. Weeks later, I traveled to a remote monastery in northern Scotland to examine a fire-damaged collection. The journey took nearly 8 hours by train and another hour along narrow mountain roads. The monastery overlooked cliffs where waves crashed endlessly against dark stone. Inside, centuries of manuscripts waited beneath temporary shelters. An elderly monk greeted me with warm tea. "We've heard about you. I hope not too much." He chuckled. "Enough." He led me into the library. Smoke had blackened the ceiling. Several shelves had collapsed. Yet many manuscripts remained intact beneath layers of ash. I carefully lifted the first volume. It survived. Barely. Sometimes barely is enough. The monk smiled. "I suspected you'd say something like that." For nearly 3 weeks, I worked alongside volunteers. No one cared about headlines. No one asked about scandals. They only asked what could still be saved. The simplicity felt almost sacred. On my final evening there, I stood outside overlooking the sea. The wind carried the scent of salt and pine. My phone vibrated. "Daniel, how's Scotland?" "Cold." He laughed. "The museum reopened its west wing today. I saw the announcement. They've named the conservation library after you." I closed my eyes. They shouldn't have. I thought you'd say that. And they did it anyway. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel quietly added, "You know what? I used to think your greatest strength was restoring paintings." I waited. I was wrong. "What is it then?" "You taught people that walking away isn't quitting." The waves crashed below the cliffs. I looked toward the horizon where fading sunlight met the sea. "No." My voice was almost lost in the wind. I only stopped confusing silence with surrender. When the call ended, I remained there until darkness covered the coastline. The world felt wider than it ever had inside museum walls. Not because the past had disappeared, because it no longer determined where I would go next. Some masterpieces were discovered beneath dust. Others were rebuilt one quiet decision at a time. Spring returned with the scent of rain on old stone. The National Archives courtyard was alive with blooming white magnolias, their petals drifting lazily across the paths where scholars hurried between buildings. I arrived earlier than usual, not because work demanded it, because today, for the first time in nearly a year, I intended to visit the museum. Not as an employee, not as a witness, simply as a visitor. Helena noticed the invitation tucked beneath my notebook. "So," I looked up. "So, you've decided. I think avoiding a place forever gives it too much power." She smiled. "That's a healthy conclusion. It took longer than restoring any painting. People usually do." She reached into a cabinet and removed a pair of white conservation gloves. The same kind I had worn almost every day for 12 years. She handed them to me. "A gift. I already have several pairs." "Not these." I unfolded them carefully. Inside the cuff, stitched by hand in pale blue thread, were 3 small words. "Steady hands. Always." I laughed quietly. "I'll wear them." I know. The museum looked different. Not because the architecture had changed, because the atmosphere had. The grand entrance no longer displayed oversized donor banners. Instead, visitors were greeted by a simple exhibition title, "The Invisible Hands of Restoration." I stopped walking. Daniel noticed me before I entered. He hurried outside, now wearing the badge of assistant head conservator. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Neither was I." He smiled. "They'll be glad." "I didn't come for them." "I know. I came for the paintings." His smile widened. "I hoped you'd say that." Inside, the galleries felt quieter. Not physically, emotionally. Information panels beside restored works now listed every conservator involved. Assistants, researchers, laboratory technicians. Everyone. Small names. Important names. The people visitors had never noticed before. I paused before a landscape I had restored years ago. For the first time, the plaque beneath it read, "Lead Conservator, Rowan Hale." No fanfare. Just truth. Daniel stood beside me. It should have been there from the beginning. Yes. It wasn't. No. Another silence. Then he pointed toward the new conservation education wing. There's someone waiting. Chairman Lewis Harper stood alone inside the old restoration studio. The room had been renovated. New equipment, improved lighting, transparent review stations where visitors could observe conservators at work. Nothing hidden, nothing isolated. He turned as I entered. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure I would. I understand. For a moment, we simply looked around the room. This used to feel smaller, I said. It was. He smiled sadly. Not physically. I nodded. He understood. Lewis walked to a display cabinet. Inside rested my old brass office key, my original employee badge, the folded resignation letter. I frowned. You kept these? They belong to the museum's history. He met my eyes. So does our failure. I read the plaque beneath the display. The Hale reforms. It described the institutional changes introduced after the investigation. Independent attribution. Protected reporting. Mandatory peer review. Ethics oversight. No heroic language. No attempt to glorify scandal. Only lessons. Lewis spoke quietly. I wanted to ask something. I'm listening. Would you tell the new conservators why you left? I looked through the glass wall into the training studio beyond. Young restorers leaned over damaged canvases with complete concentration. Hope. That was what I saw. I'll tell them something different. What? I'll tell them why they should never have to. Lewis lowered his head. That's fair. The lecture hall held nearly 80 young conservators. Some had only recently graduated. Others were apprentices beginning their first restoration placements. They expected a technical seminar. Instead, I stood before them with no slides. No prepared speech. Only Helena's gloves folded in my hands. I've been asked many times, I began, what the most important restoration technique is. The room became still. People expect me to say patience. A few smiled. Or chemistry. Someone nodded. Or observation. I looked around the hall. Those matter. I paused. But none of them matter if you stop telling the truth. Silence settled naturally. Not uncomfortable. Attentive. I once believed excellence would protect me. I walked slowly across the stage. It won't. Several students exchanged uncertain glances. Skill earns admiration. I looked toward the restored paintings displayed along the walls. Integrity earns trust. And when those two are separated, I let the sentence remain unfinished, because they already understood. One student raised her hand. What did you do when no one believed you? I smiled gently. I kept documenting the truth. Another asked, weren't you angry? Very. What stopped you from fighting? I thought carefully before answering. I realized I was protecting people who had stopped protecting what was right. The hall remained silent. Not one phone was visible. Not one whisper. Just listening. When the lecture ended, students gathered quietly around the restored works instead of around me, discussing techniques, pigments, conservation ethics, exactly as they should. As I prepared to leave, Daniel caught up with me outside. You've changed this place. I looked back at the museum. No, the people inside changed it. They only started after you left. I smiled. Sometimes leaving is the only way people notice what was holding everything together. He laughed softly. I'll remember that. So will they. Several months later, I returned to the monastery in Scotland. The fire-damaged manuscripts had all been stabilized. The library smelled once again of old paper instead of smoke. The elderly monk greeted me with the same quiet smile. You've come back. I promised I would. He handed me a newly bound volume. Inside were photographs documenting every stage of the restoration. The final page contained a handwritten inscription. History survives because someone chooses care over recognition. I closed the book. Outside, the sea stretched endlessly beneath a sky washed clean by rain. I stood at the cliff's edge, listening to the waves below. The masterpiece that had changed my life was now displayed safely in a national gallery. Visitors admired its beauty every day. Most would never know my name. And that was perfectly fine, because the truth no longer needed defending. It simply existed. The museum had recovered. Young conservators had inherited a better institution. Daniel had become the kind of leader I once hoped to find. Lewis had spent the remainder of his career rebuilding trust instead of reputation. As for Evelyn, she disappeared from professional conservation entirely. No dramatic downfall. No public spectacle. only the quiet consequence of a life built upon borrowed work. In the end, no one destroyed her. She simply reached the moment when there was nothing left to hide behind. The wind carried another spray of salt across the cliffs. I slipped Helena's gloves into my coat pocket and began the walk back toward the monastery. Years earlier, I had believed the masterpiece was the greatest thing I would ever save. I had been wrong. The hardest restoration had never hung inside a gilded frame. It had been the slow, patient reconstruction of a man who finally understood that walking away from what diminishes you is not the end of your story. Sometimes, it is the first honest brushstroke of everything that follows.